You know, Laura, there is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Because when people talk about learning English, they usually ask the same kinds of questions. How can I memorize more words? How can I learn grammar faster? How can I stop making mistakes? How can I speak perfectly? And of course, I understand those questions. They make sense. Most English learners have been trained to think that way. They believe English is like a big mountain, and the only way to climb it is to study harder, memorize more, repeat more, correct more, and push themselves until one day, finally, they feel ready. But I think the truth is a little different. I don't think most people struggle with English because they are lazy. I don't think they struggle because they are not intelligent. I don't think they struggle because they started too late, or because their memory is bad, or because they don't have a talent for languages. I think many people struggle because they are learning English the hard way. And by the hard way, I don't mean the slow way. I mean the unnatural way. The way that makes English feel heavier than it really is. The way that turns communication into pressure. The way that makes every sentence feel like a test. And when every sentence feels like a test, of course, speaking becomes exhausting. Imagine this. You want to learn how to dance, but instead of dancing with music, instead of moving with someone, instead of feeling the rhythm, you sit alone in a room and study diagrams of where your feet should go. You read the theory of dancing. You memorize the names of the movements. You watch people dance and think, okay, I understand what they're doing, but you never really move. And then one day someone says, come on, dance with us. And suddenly your body freezes. Not because you don't know anything, not because you didn't study, but because studying dance and dancing are not the same thing. And I think English is very similar. A lot of learners have studied English for years. They know grammar rules. They know vocabulary. They can understand videos. They can read posts. They can recognize phrases. But when it is time to speak, something changes. The brain starts searching for the perfect word. The mind starts checking grammar. The person starts thinking about pronunciation. Then they start thinking about how they sound. Then they start thinking about whether the other person is judging them. And before they even finish the sentence, English stops being communication. It becomes a mental performance. That is the hard way. And the strange thing is, many learners think that this pressure means they need to study more. They think, I froze because I don't know enough. I made mistakes because I need more grammar. I forgot that word because my English is weak. But sometimes the problem is not that you don't know enough. Sometimes the problem is that you are trying to speak with a study brain instead of a communication brain. And those are not the same. A study brain wants control. It wants certainty. It wants the perfect answer. It wants to avoid mistakes. But a communication brain is different. A communication brain wants connection. It wants meaning. It wants to express something. Even if the sentence is not perfect, it wants to keep going. It wants to understand and be understood. And that is where natural English begins. Not when you know every rule. Not when you memorize every word. Not when your accent disappears. Natural English begins when your brain stops treating every conversation like an exam. I think this is why so many learners feel confused. They say, I have studied English for 10 years, but I still cannot speak naturally. And honestly, that sentence makes perfect sense, because studying English for 10 years does not automatically mean you have practiced communicating for 10 years. Those are different experiences. You can study a language for a long time and still not feel comfortable using it. Just like you can read about swimming for years and still feel nervous when you enter the water. At some point, the body needs the experience. The brain needs the rhythm. Your ears need repetition. Your mouth needs practice. Your confidence needs small wins. And your mind needs to learn that communication is not dangerous. Because for many adult learners, English feels dangerous. Not physically dangerous, of course, but emotionally dangerous. They are afraid of looking silly. They are afraid of being corrected. They are afraid of sounding less intelligent than they really are. They are afraid that their personality disappears when they speak English. And that is a very real feeling. In your native language, you can be funny. You can be serious. You can be warm. You can be sarcastic. You can explain your ideas clearly. You feel like yourself. But in English, suddenly you feel smaller, simpler, slower, less expressive, and that can be frustrating. So what do people do? They go back to studying because studying feels safe. Studying feels private. Studying does not judge you. A grammar exercise does not look at your face. A vocabulary list does not interrupt you. A textbook does not laugh. So studying becomes a comfortable place to hide. But communication requires something else. It requires you to allow yourself to be imperfect in real time. And that is the part many people were never trained to do. They were trained to answer correctly. They were not trained to communicate naturally. They were trained to pass tests. They were not trained to enjoy conversation. They were trained to avoid mistakes. They were not trained to recover from mistakes and keep speaking. And that is why English starts to feel so difficult. Not because English itself is impossible, but because the method creates fear. The method creates tension. The method teaches your brain that English is something you must get right, instead of something you can use. And I think that is the big shift. English is not only something to study. English is something to use, even before it is perfect, especially before it is perfect. Because using the language is how it becomes alive. You can memorize the phrase, "I agree with you," but it becomes real when you use it in a conversation. You can understand the word "actually," but it becomes natural when you hear it many times, in many situations, from real people. You can learn the grammar of a sentence, but it becomes yours when you say it because you actually have something to express. That is why conversations are so powerful. They do something that grammar exercises cannot do by themselves. They connect English to emotion, to memory, to personality, to real life. And when English connects to real life, your brain starts to relax. It stops asking, "Is this perfect?" and starts asking, "What am I trying to say?" That question changes everything, because when your focus moves from perfection to meaning, English becomes lighter. You still make mistakes. Of course you do. Everybody does. But mistakes no longer stop the conversation. They become part of the process. And slowly, your brain learns a new message. I can survive this. I can speak and still be respected. I can forget a word and still continue. I can be imperfect and still communicate. That is how confidence is built. Not by waiting until English feels easy, but by making English feel normal. And maybe that is the real problem with the hard way. It makes English feel like an event. Something big, something serious, something you must prepare for. But natural speakers do not experience language that way. They just use it. They don't think, "Now I am practicing my communication skills." They order coffee. They ask questions. They tell stories. They complain about traffic. They laugh. They explain what happened yesterday. Language is not a performance. It is a tool for living. And I think English learners deserve to experience English that way too. Not as a subject, not as a punishment, not as a constant reminder of what they don't know, but as a living language they can slowly enter, little by little. So maybe the question is not, how can I study harder? Maybe the better question is, how can I make English feel more natural in my life? Because when English becomes part of your life, it stops being a mountain. It becomes a path. And you don't need to climb the whole mountain today. You just need to take the next natural step. That is what I want to talk about in this episode. Not a magic trick, not a shortcut, not a secret formula, just a different way to think about learning English. A way that is softer, but not weaker. A way that is more natural, but still serious. A way that respects how the brain actually learns. Because maybe English is not as hard as it feels. Maybe the way we learned it made it feel hard.
Jordan, I smiled when you said that English starts to feel like a test, because I think almost every adult learner knows exactly what that feels like. And the strange part is that most of us don't realize where that feeling comes from. It didn't appear overnight. It was built over years. Think about how most of us experienced school. We were rewarded for getting the right answer. We were corrected every time we made a mistake. Sometimes we even felt embarrassed if we answered too quickly and got something wrong. Little by little, our brains learned something that seemed completely normal. Mistakes are bad. Wrong answers should be avoided. Silence is safer than being incorrect. Now that system makes sense if you're taking a math test. It even makes sense in some academic subjects. But languages are different. Language is not only knowledge, language is interaction. It's messy. It's spontaneous. It's emotional. Nobody plans every sentence they say in their native language. Imagine having lunch with your best friend. You're laughing. You're telling a story. Someone interrupts you. You forget a word. You change your sentence halfway through. Maybe you say something that doesn't come out exactly the way you wanted. Does the conversation stop? Of course not. Nobody even notices. The conversation keeps moving. Because the goal isn't perfection. The goal is connection. But somehow, when people switch to English, everything changes. Suddenly, every sentence feels like it has to be approved before it's allowed to leave your mouth. Your brain becomes an editor instead of a communicator. It's almost like having a little teacher sitting on your shoulder all the time. That's not the correct tense. Maybe that's not the right preposition. Your pronunciation wasn't perfect. You should probably stay quiet. That voice becomes so loud that it drowns out the actual conversation. And here's what fascinates me. Most learners believe that voice is helping them. They think it's protecting them from making mistakes. But very often, it's the thing that's preventing them from speaking at all. I remember talking to a woman who had been studying English for almost 15 years. She understood movies. She could read books. She had an excellent vocabulary. But when she met international co-workers, she barely spoke. One day I asked her a simple question. What are you afraid will happen? She stopped for a moment, then she smiled, and she said something I'll never forget. I'm afraid they'll discover that my English isn't as good as they think. Think about that. Nobody had criticized her. Nobody had laughed at her. Nobody had told her to stop speaking. The pressure was coming entirely from inside her own mind. She had created an impossible standard. She believed that every sentence had to sound fluent. Every answer had to be intelligent. Every conversation had to prove something. And that's an exhausting way to communicate, because communication was never meant to be proof of intelligence. It's simply the sharing of ideas, sometimes clearly, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes awkwardly, but always moving forward. I think children understand this much better than adults. A child learning a language doesn't worry about sounding impressive. They don't stop talking because they forgot one word. They invent words. They point at things. They laugh. They repeat themselves. They experiment constantly. And because they're willing to experiment, they improve incredibly fast. Adults often do the opposite. We wait. We prepare. We rehearse conversations in our heads. We imagine every possible question. We search for perfect sentences. Then the real conversation begins, and the other person says something we didn't expect. Suddenly, the entire mental script disappears, and we panic. Not because we don't know English, but because real conversations are alive. They're unpredictable. That's actually what makes them interesting. No two conversations are ever exactly the same. That's why communication is a skill you experience, not a script you memorize. I think one of the biggest changes we can make is giving ourselves permission to sound like learners, because that's exactly what we are. Not because we're incapable, but because we're growing. There's nothing embarrassing about learning. In fact, every fluent speaker you've ever admired has gone through that exact same stage. Every one of them. There was a time when they searched for words, when they mispronounced sentences, when they misunderstood people, when they felt nervous introducing themselves. The difference is not that they avoided those moments. The difference is that they kept having them. Again and again and again, until one day those uncomfortable moments became ordinary, and ordinary practice slowly became confidence. I think that's something we don't celebrate enough. We celebrate fluency, but we rarely celebrate persistence. We admire the person who speaks beautifully, but we forget about the thousands of imperfect conversations that made that fluency possible. Maybe that's because we only see the final result. We don't see the years of hesitation behind it. We don't see the mistakes. We don't see the embarrassing moments. We don't see the small victories, but they're all there, hidden beneath every confident speaker. So maybe the real question isn't, how can I avoid making mistakes? Maybe it's, how can I become comfortable continuing after a mistake? Because those are two completely different goals. One creates fear. The other creates resilience. And I honestly believe resilience is one of the most important skills any English learner can develop. Not because it makes mistakes disappear, but because it stops mistakes from controlling the conversation. And once that happens, speaking English starts to feel surprisingly different. Not easier because you've learned thousands of new words overnight. Easier because you've stopped carrying so much unnecessary pressure. Sometimes the biggest improvement isn't adding something new. Sometimes it's simply putting something heavy down. And I think that's exactly what many English learners have been carrying for years without even realizing it.
Laura, I think you said something that really matters. You talked about permission to sound like a learner, and I honestly believe that one small idea changes everything. Because most adults never give themselves that permission. Instead, they give themselves expectations. I should already know this. I've been studying for years. I shouldn't make this mistake anymore. I should sound more fluent by now. Listen to those sentences. They're all focused on where someone thinks they should be, not where they actually are. And I wonder how different learning would feel if we replaced expectations with curiosity. Instead of saying, I should already know this. What if we said, that's interesting, I didn't know that. One sentence creates frustration. The other creates learning. Children naturally live in curiosity. Adults often live in expectation, and expectations can become incredibly heavy, especially in language learning, because every conversation becomes a comparison. You compare yourself to native speakers, to YouTubers, to your coworker, to someone who has been learning English for 10 years, to someone who has been learning for 6 months. It's endless. And comparison has a strange effect. It makes progress invisible because you're always looking at someone who's farther ahead. I remember something that happened years ago. I met 2 students who had almost the same English level. If you gave them a listening exercise, they scored almost the same. If you gave them a reading test, the results were almost identical. But when it came to conversation, they were completely different. One person spoke constantly. The other barely opened their mouth. Not because one knew more English, because one accepted being imperfect. The other didn't. That experience stayed with me because it made me realize that knowledge and communication are not the same skill. They're connected, but they're not identical. Think about driving a car. You can memorize every traffic sign. You can study every rule in the driver's manual. You can even watch hundreds of driving videos. But the first time you actually drive in traffic, everything feels different. Your hands grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Your attention is everywhere at once. You're trying to remember every rule at the exact same time, and it's exhausting. Now compare that to someone who has been driving for 15 years. They aren't thinking about every movement. Their brain has stopped treating driving as a sequence of rules. It has become an experience. I think language follows the same path. At the beginning, your brain pays attention to everything. Grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, word order, verb tense, every little detail. But over time, those separate pieces begin to connect. Not because you forced them to, because you've experienced them enough times. That's something we rarely talk about. Experience changes the brain differently than information does. Information tells you something. Experience convinces you. For example, I can tell you that native speakers don't expect perfect English. You might believe me, maybe, but after you've had 20 conversations where people smile, help you, understand you, and continue talking, you don't need my advice anymore. You've experienced it, and experience is much stronger than explanation. That's why I think many learners spend too much time collecting information. They watch another video, buy another course, download another app, read another grammar article, search for another method, not because they're lazy, actually, usually because they're incredibly motivated. They're trying so hard to improve, but sometimes effort points in the wrong direction. Imagine someone trying to become a better swimmer. Every day they read books about swimming. Every weekend they watch Olympic races. They learn different breathing techniques. They understand body position. They know the science, but they almost never enter the water. Would we expect that person to become comfortable swimming? Probably not. Not because the books are useless. Books are valuable. Videos are valuable. Courses are valuable. But their preparation, not the experience itself. And I think many English learners accidentally stay in preparation mode for years. They're always getting ready to speak, getting ready to travel, getting ready for the next level, getting ready until one day they realize they've been preparing much longer than they've been communicating. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly freeing because if communication is the missing piece, then the solution isn't mysterious. You don't need a completely different brain. You don't need extraordinary talent. You don't need perfect pronunciation. You need more real experiences with English. Little ones, simple ones, safe ones, repeated over time. That's how familiarity grows. And familiarity creates confidence. Not overnight, not in one magical conversation, but little by little. You stop translating every sentence. You stop checking every verb. You stop wondering if your accent is acceptable because your attention slowly moves toward the other person, toward the conversation itself, and something beautiful happens. English becomes less about English and more about people. You become curious about someone's story, someone's opinion, someone's culture, someone's joke, someone's dream. The language quietly moves into the background, almost like music in a movie. It's still there. It's important, but it's no longer the center of your attention. The conversation becomes the center. And I think that's when people finally begin to understand what fluency really feels like. Not perfect, not effortless, just natural. Natural enough that your ideas become more important than your grammar. Natural enough that you laugh before you remember you're speaking another language. Natural enough that you finish a conversation and only afterward realize, I just spent 10 minutes thinking about the person, not about my English. To me, that's one of the biggest signs that someone is becoming a real communicator. Not because they stopped learning, but because communication finally became stronger than self-consciousness. And once that balance begins to change, everything else starts changing with it.
Exactly, Jordan. And I think that idea of preparation mode is so important because many English learners are not doing nothing. They are doing a lot. They are watching videos. They are saving vocabulary posts. They are writing down expressions. They are following English teachers on social media. They are downloading apps. They are listening to podcasts. They are trying to improve every day. So when they still feel nervous speaking, it feels unfair. They think, why am I not fluent yet? Why does speaking still feel difficult? Why can I understand so much, but say so little? And I think that question hurts because the effort is real. The problem is not the effort. The problem is where the effort goes. Sometimes people are working very hard, but their practice is still too passive. They receive English, they watch English, they recognize English, they understand English, but they rarely produce English. And producing a language feels different. It's one thing to hear a sentence and think, yes, I understand that. It's another thing to create a sentence while someone is waiting for your answer. That little moment of pressure changes everything. And the only way to get comfortable with that moment is to experience it more often, but not always in a scary way. I think this is where many learners misunderstand practice. They imagine practice has to be dramatic, like speaking with strangers for 1 hour, joining a big conversation group, making a perfect presentation, talking to native speakers without preparation. And for some people, that's too much too soon, so they avoid speaking completely. But communication practice can start smaller, much smaller. It can start with answering a simple question out loud when you're alone. What did I do today? What do I think about this video? What would I say if someone asked me this? It can start with repeating a sentence, but then changing one part of it. I went to the store. I went to the gym. I went to work. I went to see a friend. That may sound simple, but simple is not useless. Simple is how the brain builds trust, because the brain needs evidence, not motivational quotes. Evidence. Evidence that you can produce English. Evidence that you can survive a pause. Evidence that you can make a small mistake and continue. Evidence that you can speak even when the sentence is not beautiful. That evidence accumulates, one small moment at a time. I like to think about it like building a bridge. You don't build a bridge by jumping across the river. You build it piece by piece. And each small piece gives you a little more confidence to go farther. For many learners, the jump feels impossible because the bridge was never built. They go from studying alone to suddenly needing to speak in a real situation, and the distance is too big. So they freeze, not because they're weak, because the step was too large. A smarter approach is to create smaller steps between studying and real conversation. First, speak to yourself, then record yourself, then answer simple questions, then send a voice message, then have a short conversation, then a longer one, then a conversation with less preparation, then a conversation about a topic you didn't expect. That progression feels natural. It teaches your nervous system that English is not an emergency. And I really believe that matters. Because language learning is not only intellectual, it's emotional. Your body is involved. Your breathing changes, your shoulders get tense, your face feels warm, your mind starts racing. And when your body feels threatened, your English often disappears. That's not because you forgot everything. It's because pressure makes access harder. You may know the word, but in that moment, your brain can't reach it. Later, when you're alone, the word appears immediately. And you think, why didn't I say that? That experience can be so frustrating, but it doesn't mean your English is bad. It means your nervous system needs more safe exposure. Safe exposure is powerful, not because it removes challenge, but because it makes challenge manageable. You want enough difficulty to grow, but not so much fear that you shut down. That's the balance. And I think every learner needs to find their own version of that balance. For one person, the next step might be speaking for 30 seconds alone. For another person, it might be joining an online conversation group. For someone else, it might be asking one question at work. The important thing is not that the step looks impressive. The important thing is that the step is real. Real output, real expression, real use of the language. Because English changes when it leaves your head. Inside your head, English can stay perfect forever. You can imagine beautiful sentences. You can plan them. You can correct them. You can start over. But real speaking does not give you unlimited time. And that's why it teaches you something planning cannot teach. It teaches you flexibility. You learn how to say something another way. You learn how to pause without panicking. You learn how to ask for clarification. You learn how to keep going when the sentence is not perfect. Those are real communication skills. And sometimes they matter more than advanced grammar. A person with simple English but good flexibility can often communicate better than a person with advanced knowledge but no practice speaking. That sounds strange at first, but we see it all the time. Someone says simple sentences. Maybe the grammar is not perfect. Maybe the vocabulary is basic, but they smile. They listen. They respond. They continue. They connect, and everyone understands them. Meanwhile, another learner knows much more, but says almost nothing because every sentence feels risky. So the issue is not only English level. The issue is comfort with using the English you already have. That comfort is trained. Just like pronunciation is trained, just like listening is trained, confidence is trained too. Not by pretending to be confident, but by creating enough small experiences that your brain slowly stops treating English like danger. And I think that's where many learners can begin immediately, not by changing their entire life, not by studying 6 hours a day, not by waiting for the perfect teacher, but by asking a simple question. How can I use a little English today? Not study, use. Maybe you describe your morning. Maybe you repeat one idea from this episode in your own words. Maybe you record a 1-minute voice note. Maybe you comment on a video. Maybe you read something aloud. Maybe you ask someone a simple question. Small use creates movement, and movement creates identity. You stop being only a student of English. You begin becoming a user of English. That identity shift is powerful because students often wait for permission. Users experiment. Students wait until they know enough. Users learn while using. Students ask, is this correct? Users ask, can I express this? And I think for many adult learners, that is the real door. Not more pressure, not more shame, not more rules, but a gentle shift from collecting English to living a little bit of English every day. That is where the hard way slowly becomes a more natural way.
Laura, I love the way you said that. From collecting English to living a little bit of English every day. That feels like the heart of this whole conversation. Because I think many learners imagine that one day English will suddenly become natural. Like there will be a moment when everything clicks. One day they will wake up and speaking will feel easy. One day they will have enough vocabulary. One day they will finally understand grammar. One day they will stop feeling nervous. And after that day arrives, then they will start using English confidently. But I think it's usually the other way around. English becomes natural because you start using it before it feels natural. That's the uncomfortable part. But it's also the hopeful part, because it means you don't need to wait for some perfect future version of yourself. You can begin with the English you have today, not the English you wish you had, not the English someone else has, the English you have right now. Maybe it's simple, maybe it's slow, maybe you forget words, maybe your sentences are short, maybe you still translate sometimes. Maybe you don't know how to express everything you feel. That's okay. That is still English, and that English is enough to begin. I think a lot of learners underestimate the value of simple English. They hear someone speak fluently and think, I want to sound like that. And of course, that's understandable. Fluent speech is beautiful. It flows. It feels easy. It sounds confident. But fluent speech is built from simple speech used thousands of times. There is no shortcut around that. A fluent speaker did not skip simple sentences. They lived through them. They said basic things again and again until those basic things became automatic. Then they added more. A little more vocabulary, a little more rhythm, a little more emotion, a little more personality, and over time, the language became wider. But it started small, and I think this is where many adults feel embarrassed. They don't want to sound simple, especially intelligent adults, people with careers, degrees, families, responsibilities, people who can express complex ideas in their own language. When they speak English, suddenly they feel like they have to say small sentences, and that can feel humiliating. But simple is not stupid. Simple is not childish. Simple is not failure. Simple is the foundation. There is a big difference between being simple because you don't care and being simple because you are building control. A good communicator can express an idea simply. A strong speaker does not always need complicated language. In fact, many powerful ideas are simple. I disagree. I need more time. I don't understand yet. Can you explain that again? I have a different opinion. That makes sense? I think there's another way to see this. Those are not advanced sentences, but they are useful. They create real communication. They move conversations forward. And if a learner can say those things with calmness, with clarity, with presence, that person is already communicating. Maybe not perfectly, but effectively. An effective communication should be respected. I think part of learning English the natural way is becoming proud of useful English. Not only impressive English. Useful English helps you ask for help. Useful English helps you make friends. Useful English helps you work. Useful English helps you travel. Useful English helps you participate. Impressive English is nice, but useful English changes your life. And sometimes learners chase impressive English so much that they ignore the simple English that would actually open doors for them today. They say, I can't join a conversation because I don't know enough advanced expressions. But maybe they can ask one question. Maybe they can say one opinion. Maybe they can agree. Maybe they can laugh and respond. Maybe they can say, actually, I had a similar experience. That one sentence can open a conversation. And one real conversation is more powerful than another hour of waiting to feel ready. I don't mean that study is useless. Study matters. Grammar matters. Vocabulary matters. Listening matters. Reading matters. But they should support communication. They should not replace it. When study replaces communication, English becomes heavy. When study supports communication, English becomes alive. That's the difference. Imagine two learners. The first learner studies 2 hours every day, but never speaks. The second learner studies less, but uses English every day in small ways. They describe their day. They record voice notes. They answer questions. They talk to someone for 5 minutes. They read out loud. They repeat phrases and change them. They make mistakes and continue. After 6 months, the second learner often feels more natural, not because they studied more, because they connected study to use. Their brain is not only storing English, it is organizing English for real life. And that is what the brain needs. A reason to retrieve the language, a reason to move it from memory into action. Because knowing a word is one thing. Finding that word during a conversation is another thing. Understanding a sentence is one thing. Building a sentence while someone listens is another thing. Recognizing English is one thing. Using English is another thing. And the only way to improve using is by using. That sounds simple, almost too simple. But simple truths are often the ones we avoid because they require action. They require discomfort. They require small risks. They require us to stop hiding behind preparation. And I say that with compassion because preparation can feel very safe. It gives you the feeling that you're improving without exposing yourself. And sometimes, yes, preparation is necessary, but at some point, preparation has to become participation. You cannot prepare forever. There has to be a moment when you enter the conversation, not perfectly, not dramatically, not with pressure, just honestly, with the English you have. I think this is why we need to redefine progress. Progress is not only learning a new tense. Progress is also answering faster than last month. Progress is pausing without panic. Progress is asking someone to repeat without feeling ashamed. Progress is saying, let me think, instead of disappearing. Progress is using a simple word when you can't remember the perfect one. Progress is finishing the conversation even though you made mistakes. Progress is realizing that your English did not collapse just because it was imperfect. Those moments matter. They may not look impressive from the outside, but inside the learner, they are huge. Because every one of those moments teaches the brain, this is possible. And once the brain begins to believe that English is possible, motivation changes. You don't practice only because you feel guilty. You practice because you feel movement. You feel evidence. You feel small confidence growing. And confidence built from evidence is very different from confidence built from wishful thinking. You don't have to repeat, I am fluent. I am fluent. I am fluent. You start thinking, I handled that conversation. I understood more than before. I said what I needed to say. I didn't quit. That is real confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't need to be loud. It just grows. And maybe that's the natural way. Not easy every day. Not perfect. Not fast in a magical way. But honest. Human. Connected to real life. Instead of asking English to become easy before you use it, you use English gently until it becomes easier. That is a completely different relationship with the language. And for many learners, it might be the first time English feels like something they can actually live with, not just something they have to study.
Jordan, I think that's the perfect place to end this conversation. Because when people ask, what's the fastest way to learn English? They're usually expecting a technique, a website, a course, a secret method. But after everything we've talked about today, I think the answer is much quieter than that. The fastest way isn't always doing more. Sometimes it's removing what has been slowing you down all along. The fear, the pressure, the constant feeling that every sentence has to prove something. When those things begin to disappear, learning starts feeling lighter. And when learning feels lighter, people usually become more consistent. That's something I've noticed over and over again. Consistency rarely comes from discipline alone. It often comes from enjoyment. Think about the hobbies people keep for years. Playing an instrument, cooking, photography, running, dancing. Most people don't continue because every practice session is perfect. They continue because the activity becomes part of their life. It becomes something they genuinely enjoy returning to. I believe English deserves to feel that way too. Not like homework that never ends. Not like a subject you're constantly trying to pass. But like another way to experience the world, another way to meet people, another way to understand ideas. Another way to tell your own story, because that's really what a language is. It's not a collection of grammar rules. It's a bridge between people, and bridges are meant to be crossed, not admired from a distance. Sometimes I imagine two different learners. The first learner waits until everything feels perfect. They keep saying, next month I'll start speaking. After I finish this course, after I memorize more vocabulary, after my pronunciation improves, there's always another condition, another reason to wait. Meanwhile, the second learner begins before feeling ready. They speak with simple sentences. They pause. They smile. They search for words. Sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they laugh at those mistakes. And then they continue. 1 year later, which learner has more confidence? Usually the one who was willing to be imperfect, not because they were naturally brave, because they practiced being uncomfortable until it slowly became comfortable. That gives me a lot of hope, because courage isn't something you're born with. Sometimes courage is simply repetition, doing one small thing often enough that it stops feeling frightening. And maybe English works exactly the same way. The first conversation feels difficult. The 10th feels manageable. The 50th feels familiar. The 100th feels surprisingly normal. Not because you've become someone else, but because your relationship with English has changed. You're no longer trying to survive every conversation. You're simply having one. And I think that's one of the most beautiful moments in language learning. The day you stop thinking, I am speaking English, and you start thinking, I'm telling a story. I'm asking a question. I'm making someone laugh. I'm sharing an idea. The language quietly steps into the background. Your personality steps forward. That, to me, is real progress. Not sounding exactly like a native speaker, but sounding more like yourself. Because the world doesn't need another perfect English speaker. The world needs more people willing to connect despite their imperfections. That applies to English, but honestly, it also applies to life. How many opportunities have we missed because we believed we weren't ready? How many conversations never happened? How many friendships never started? How many dreams stayed exactly where they were simply because we waited for confidence to arrive first? Sometimes confidence isn't the beginning of the journey. Sometimes it's the reward for taking it. I think learning English teaches us something much bigger than vocabulary. It teaches us that growth is rarely comfortable, that progress is usually quiet, that small actions matter, that mistakes lose their power when we stop treating them like disasters. and that showing up again tomorrow is often more important than having a perfect day today. If someone listening to us right now remembers only one idea from this entire episode, I hope it's this. Don't ask yourself whether your English is perfect. Ask yourself whether you're using it. Don't ask whether you know enough. Ask whether you're becoming a little more comfortable than you were last month. Don't compare your English with someone else's chapter 20. Compare it with your own chapter 1. Because that's the comparison that actually tells the truth. Every conversation, every voice message, every question, every small success, every awkward pause that you survived, they're all part of the same story. A story that doesn't end with perfection. It ends with freedom. The freedom to express yourself, the freedom to travel, the freedom to build relationships, the freedom to discover opportunities that once felt impossible. And maybe that's what learning a language has always been about. Not becoming someone different, but giving yourself one more way to be who you already are. So if you've been learning English the hard way, maybe today doesn't have to be the day you study harder. Maybe today can simply be the day you speak a little more. One sentence, one conversation, one small step. Because sometimes one small step is exactly where a completely different journey begins. And I hope we'll be here to walk that journey with you. See you in the next episode.